Hello and welcome to On Point. I'm Gabrielle Ortega. For years, researchers and social critics have worried that the newest generation of American adults is less interested in news than those who grew up in the pre-digital age. This concern has come from data that suggests adults age 18 to 34, or the millennial generation, do not visit news sites, read print newspapers, watch television news, or seek out news in great numbers. This generation instead spends more time on social networks, often on mobile devices. The worry is that millennials' awareness of the world is narrow, their discovery of events is passive, and that news is just a random element in their social feed.
I think millennials have a lot of access to news, especially probably more than other generations, because a lot of social media sites giving away news information, other sources as well. I think it's more about a mindset. Certain people may or may not want to hear about the news, and there are certain outlets that offer different biases and whatnot. So I think that millennials are interested. It's just with the diversity of sources, it's hard to really pinpoint one area that is really important or really influential to certain people.
I think they're more informed than people assume because we have access to so much of the information, and I think people of our age, since the future lies in our hands, we do tend to stay more involved.
Mostly college campus, for what I've seen here at CSUN, a lot of students are, but if you were to venture away from campuses, I think it's less likely. I mean, since we're focused on studies, I'd say most of us here, at least we know about, for example, like Syria, the Aleppo bombing that went on, whereas I think if you're going away from campus, those millennials may not. They may not even know where Syria is on a map.
The way we get informed is so vastly different than how people used to get informed, so they would presume that just because they're not using the old ways of getting informed with newspapers and magazines and such, that they're not being informed, and that when you look at your phone, generally they assume, oh, that's like a message, or oh, that's some frivolous picture, or it's not news. But they could be looking at their phone and reading news and getting updates on various ongoings throughout the world.
A new comprehensive study conducted by the American Press Institute and Associated Press looks closely at how people learn about the world in these different devices and platforms. The study finds that this newest generation of American adults is anything but newsless, passive, or civically uninterested. Research shows that 6 out of 10 millennials get news daily, and 85% say that keeping up with news is at least somewhat important to them. Millennials consume news and information in different ways than previous generations, and their paths to discovery are more nuanced and varied than some may have imagined. On Point, Scott Sanders has more on the story.
I'd like to thank my guests for being here. Today with me, I have Maya Cavallaro. She's a linguistics grad student and a Democratic activist. And I have Professor Tom Hogen-Esch. He's a political science professor here at CSUN. Now, the first question I'd like to ask, and it'd be for you, Professor, is you have some that feel that millennials are clueless. We have no clue what's going on. We're not aware about anything that's going on in the world. I'd like to ask you your thoughts on that.
I think everyone was saying that about us back in the 80s when I was the equivalent of a millennial, and probably every generation before that. No, I don't think millennials are really fundamentally different in the way that they interact with politics than previous generations. What's changed around us in society is that the media have fundamentally been reshaped by a whole host of factors, including social media, and that's apparently where a lot of millennials have turned to, or shows like the old Comedy Central Jon Stewart show, and the show on HBO, John Oliver's show, and sort of comedy journalism, which is now apparently one of the most trusted news sources for millennials. So yeah, I don't think that millennials are any different in the way that they engage in politics. In fact, I think in some ways they're more engaged than certainly than we were, Generation Xers back in the 80s. But the landscape of the media has just changed so much, and I can expand on that if you'd like.
Yeah.
So the media environment, through much of the 20th century was heavily regulated by the FCC. It had all kinds of rules about how much media consolidation particular media markets were willing to tolerate. We also had something called the Fairness Doctrine, which basically mandated that both sides of an issue would be covered in a news story. We essentially have a largely deregulated media now, And so you have this movement toward media consolidation where something like 85% of the media sources in this country are controlled by 6 large corporations. So you have a narrowing in some ways of the number of large voices in the mainstream media. On the other hand, you've got the internet where literally anybody can be a journalist on the internet, and they've done away with the fairness doctrine in the late 1980s, and so you've seen a movement toward partisan media. So Fox News was the first corporation to realize there's this market, this huge market out there for conservative news, followed by MSNBC. CNN has tried to play both sides of that over the years. So, when I think back to the media environment of the 1980s that I grew up on, and compare it to today, it's just like 100 years have passed or something,
Maya, your thoughts? Are we clueless or?
No, I definitely don't think millennials as a whole are clueless. And I agree. I think every generation thinks that kids these days are, whatever, that we're lazy or we're dumb. We don't know what's going on, but we're the future. Millennials are the future, and we're going to be we're going to be those old people one day saying the kids these days. But I agree. News is really different. How we interact with news and how we're entertained by news. I think it's really interesting that we want to be entertained. We don't want to just, see the facts. Sometimes we want to be entertained. But and social media it's a force. It's interesting.
It is, definitely is. And you both are on the right track, because there's the other side that says, millennials, because we're so tech savvy and because there's so much access to news these days, we're the most connected to the news and we're the most aware of what's going on. And a recent study by the Pew Research Center says that 64% of millennials say they regularly keep up with the news. Does it surprise you guys at all? This is for both of you.
No, I would almost think it's more than that. But it's interesting. I think some people pick and choose which news they pay attention to. Like, there's people who care a lot about partisan politics and the issues like that. And then I have friends who, they do know what's going on. They know other things, but they don't care about the elections. So we kind of curate our own news. But I think most millennials I know care about what's going on in our country and in the world.
Okay. Now, based on what you both said, millennials are connected. We are in the news. But where do you think we get our news from? Tom?
You tell me. Frankly, I'm not a millennial, and so it's not an area of research for me. But I think it's pretty clear that a lot of millennials are getting it from, an entertainment perspective, like the Daily Show, but also aggregated for them on their phones. And this is great because this has allowed so many more of us to be connected to what's going on. I mean, if something happens in a bombing in Yemen, everybody knows about it 10 minutes later. But one of the downsides, I think, of the instantaneous news environment and the way that it's been corporatized in this country is that when people click on news sources, advertisers are watching what you're doing. And so then they begin to hit you with, you will like these news stories as well. And so what has happened is that all of us as Americans are walking around in media silos, where we're essentially only hearing the version of news that we want to hear, the version of reality that we like. And so people may walk around thinking, oh, I've read all these articles today on my phone, and may not realize that they're only getting one version of the events. And the problem in a democracy is when everyone's walking around in a media silo, it's very difficult to have conversations about important issues, because it's almost like getting people in a room from two separate planets when it comes to the issues. And you've also, as a result of that, seen a real decline in the trust that people have in the media. So back in the middle 80s, Pew Research found that something like 55% of Americans trusted most or all of what they heard in the media. Today that's like half that. It's like 20%. And so even though there are some advantages in that the internet has been a counterbalance to the corporate press, I also see a lot of disadvantages in the sense that we're in a much more partisan media environment. And people walk around not even realizing that they have only heard, a narrow slice of what the media have to say on a particular topic.
Okay. So Maya, you mentioned social media earlier. Why do you think social media is such a big source of news for anyone in that millennial age range?
Well, we spend a lot of time on social media. I know I personally am a big fan of Facebook. I'm not such a huge fan of Twitter, but I totally understand how it can be very useful for campaigns, for less formal kind of, to get things trending, get movements going. But, we're on Facebook. We want to keep in touch with our friends, and we share the information that we care about. So, for example, I'm a linguist, and I work with endangered language documentation and revitalization. So as I network with people who have the same interests that I have, they're posting news articles that are relevant to my interests, and that's the news that I'm seeing on my Facebook newsfeed. I get to read about endangered language, apps for language learning, projects that I care about. And also, I have a lot of friends through, democratic activism here in LA, so I see articles that they post. But it's true, I hardly have any friends who, for example, are Republican activists, so I'm not seeing the news that those people would share. So I'm hearing, people who agree with me posting interesting articles that I feel strongly about. But yeah, I think Twitter especially, but social media in general, can also really be great for spreading awareness and kind of creating like this momentum for movements. The way, that's how Black Lives Matter really kind of got moving. But I don't know, I have mixed feelings about even that, because I think sometimes social media is literally the least you can do. I think a lot of people feel like if I angry tweet about this and put the right hashtag, or I share this article on my Facebook, like I've done something, I'm participating and I'm making it better. And I mean, it's true, you're spreading awareness, that is something, and I think that's important. But I think we could do more.
So it seems like social media is a really big driving force for it. And studies would show that Facebook is probably the #1 source of news for anybody who's using social media. Pew Research did a study, and they brought up 24 different news topics. Out of those 24 different topics, millennials say Facebook was their #1 source for 13 of them. So we're looking at more than 50% of the different topics that were brought up and looked at on Facebook. And we actually asked some millennials their thoughts on where they get their news from, and we have a video to show what they said.
I get most of my news from YouTube or actually watching it on TV. Things like The Daily Show, stuff like that, or even a lot of the, Jimmy Kimmel, Fallon, all of them. You have little updates with the news, things that are going on, so you get little snippets here and there.
I see most things through Twitter.
Mostly, I get most of my news from Facebook, I'll be honest. Not much from TV, mostly social media.
I get most of my news from, let's say, social media outlets, the internet. It's quicker, it's easier way of finding sources and getting them quickly.
I like to look at different blogs and explore multiple corners of the internet for my news, sometimes Reddit. But one of my favorite blogs to look at news is Mashable.
As we all thought, social media is definitely a driving force for where millennials are getting their news in this day and age.
But Scott, I don't think people really understand, have an awareness about how it works on Facebook. And I don't pretend to be an expert on how it works either. In fact, I don't think anybody really knows how Facebook works, right? It's like they're coming up with all these algorithms all the time. But I suspect they fall into the category of corporations that are selecting news that is more likely to draw clicks, which result in advertisement dollars. And then data, of course, is collected about what you're interested in, and then Facebook sells that data to other companies so that they can advertise to you. And that's one thing I do find about my students, that they're just completely oblivious to the corporatization of the internet that we all are a part of. Corporate America is basically cataloging everything that we click on. And so the question is, what's the quality of the journalism, right? People say, I get it from Facebook, as if there you go, right? I'm really well informed. But they may be really quite ill-informed and not even know it. And I think that's a problem.
And you see things go viral every once in a while that are completely false. There was that photograph recently did you follow? There was a photograph of Woodstock. And and people were saying it was the Standing Rock protests, and everyone was sharing it and saying like, this is what it looks like, and it was completely false news. But people trust what they read on Facebook because it was written and it looked like an article, so it must be true.
Does social media as a whole, or just digital media as a whole, do a good job from showing things from different angles, or is it mostly just a comedic kind of thing, or mostly just a lighter side of news?
Well, I mean, the social media doesn't really get to choose. I mean, it has its algorithms for what pops up and what you see and what gets put in what order in your news feed. But your social media news experience, I think, is also shaped by who you follow on social media. So like I was saying before, if all of my friends are, very progressive activists, then I'm going to see a lot of articles that are relevant to progressive activists, but I'm not going to see a lot of articles that would be relevant to, a Republican Christian minister in Georgia. Like it's, because that's not who I'm following on social media. What I will say, I think, like I brought up Standing Rock a second ago, and I've been very frustrated that the water protectors and the activism going on around the Dakota Access Pipeline and the actions of the company and the government, none of that's getting huge like viral mainstream media attention. And I think social media has been a really important platform for getting information out about that. It's not acceptable that that's really the only platform. I think it needs to be more mainstream and it needs to be more all over the place. It's a really big deal in our country right now. But I think it's good that we've had Facebook and we've had Twitter to spread information about that and stay informed and see updates. So
I would echo what Maya's saying. I mean, with each technological revolution, the media has changed, right? So radio, television, even go back to the 19th century, you had the telegraph, which was the first instantaneous way of communication, which was really quite a revolutionary thing in the middle of the 19th century.
Does social media, or even if you want to take it bigger and talk about just digital media as a whole, do they do a good job of presenting different kinds
no,
of
they don't.
outlets?
It's not their job at all. That's what we've given up, right? We've given up the idea that there are filters, that there are editors at newspapers or producers in a newsroom who are saying, okay, this news is whatever, in bounds that we should be covering and worthy of coverage. And today, a candidate like Donald Trump can just tweet out, Obama was born in another country and isn't president, and all of a sudden drive the news cycle for weeks and in fact years. And in fact, Trump has done such an amazing job of driving the media, the traditional media in many ways, by simply using a few tweets that he pecked out at 3 o'clock in the morning. Again, it's all advantages and disadvantages, and I think there's some amazing possibilities with social media in terms of galvanizing, social movements, but it's also incredibly problematic when, somebody can say outrageous things and then get everybody to follow it on the mainstream media, and then, all of a sudden later, maybe it turns out to be false, and yet that person has generated all of this controversy in the society. It really, in my view, it really undermines kind of a honest democratic dialogue. I feel like we've lost something over the last 20 years or so.
Okay. And you kind of just helped me segue into my next question. I was going to ask, what kind of impact do you think social media has on this year's election? Because it seemed like, based on what you were saying, how successful would Donald Trump be if social media was around? How would Hillary's campaign fare if social media was around? Do you think social media is having a big impact on this election, Maya?
Oh, definitely. Well, and I mean, if you look at the history of presidential elections in our country, like everyone talks about how John F. Kennedy, a big part of why he was elected is because it was the first kind of time that debates were on TV, and it was something people could look at the candidates, and he was such a handsome guy, and he was more appealing visually, right? And I think, as media changes, what's required of candidates changes, and now Twitter is a huge part of a political campaign, and any candidate, any politician is going to have staffers doing all their social media for them and with them, and Donald Trump tweets a lot for himself, which is a really interesting choice, but yeah, so I think it definitely factors in. It's interesting though, because I mean, whatever it is that people are saying, it gets amplified like exponentially through social media, which is one of the advantages of social media. But I hear a lot of rhetoric that I can't stand being just retweeted and retweeted or, you know, posted all over Facebook. I think a lot of people's criticisms of Hillary Clinton, for example, are very sexist, and it's very subtly sexist. You know, things like she's cold, or she yells, things like that, where it's like kind of a microaggression-y type thing, and then it just gets spread all through social media, so it's everywhere, and people don't even realize what they're saying. People are saying all this, you know, offensive, sexist stuff, and they don't even realize they're part of the problem because they're just retweeting.
Okay. So it definitely seems like a lot of millennials are getting their ideas and thoughts about the election because of social media or just wherever they're getting their news. We actually spoke to some students here on campus about their thoughts on the election and this whole political process, and we actually have video for it.
Are you familiar with any of the propositions that will be on the ballot?
Unfortunately, I'm not.
Prop 64, that's the one I'm really familiar with. Well, basically kind of familiar with, yeah.
Not really. Yeah, no, not really.
Okay.
The transit one, to get the traffic reduced in Los Angeles and build more transit areas where it's easier to connect.
So as a whole, do you feel millennials are politically aware? Are the millennials aware of what's going on? Because based on the video footage we just saw, the propositions, it seems like the little things like the propositions maybe millennials are more clueless about, but the big picture seems like, you know, with the presidential elections, everybody knows that, but the smaller bit of it, nobody really knows what's going on.
Well, I just want to say that's not a millennial thing. I think that's, if you did that same interview with non-millennials, I think you would have very similar results. Maybe not as much focus on Prop 64, but I think there's, you know, Americans, there are people who follow all of the down ballot issues, and then there's a lot of people who just vote in the presidential elections and they just vote for president. Or maybe, you know, there's an in-between. There's people who care about president and U.S. Senate, and that's it. Even among activists, I find most people don't know about the judicial candidates. Yeah. But I think there are millennials who care. A lot of my friends who are millennials, because I'm a millennial, you know, they'll ask me because they know that I follow all the propositions and I'm involved with Democratic clubs and things. So they'll send me emails saying, "Can you tell me about the propositions and what's your opinion? You know, what's the other side?" So yeah, I think it's not a millennial thing. I think there's a lot of people who don't, unfortunately, know about the down ballot issues.
So just people as a whole need to start focusing on the entire aspect of any election we have going on.
That would be lovely.
Okay. Tom, your thoughts?
Well, I'd say it's difficult. I mean, when you have 17 propositions, as we do on the ballot, and then many more for school districts in particular cities, and then statewide races and the national congressional races, U.S. Senate, president, there's more, there's almost too much democracy going on. And it's hard enough for average people or millennials, much less, I'm a political science professor, I don't know what's going on with most of these propositions. You know, the ballot initiative they sent to us was 240 pages.
Nobody's
and I think very few people are going to, but you know, what I worry most about, the way that millennials are driving the market, and let's face it, the media is now a business in this country. It used to be a heavily regulated business, now it's mostly an unregulated business, is that we're losing newspapers. Now, the LA Times is obviously the largest newspaper in the LA market, and its readership has declined drastically. And the problem is, social media is not going to be able to cover, is not going to fill in that gap once the LA Times, as we know it for the last 100 years, is gone. And where will people get information about what's going on with the City Council of Burbank? You know, if you happen to live in Burbank, for example. And so the more that we lose, you know, some of these traditional forms of media that have played this important role in our democracy, I think the more we suffer as a democracy.
Okay. So this is our last question of the discussion. Do you think there's anything that could be done to raise awareness, not only just in millennials, but everybody? You would think that social media, with it being seen by billions of people, will be a good way to get more information out. But studies may show that that's not necessarily the case, and the video footage we just saw may show that that's not necessarily the case. So do you guys have any thoughts or any insights on what could be done to try to get the best and most pertinent information out to the biggest audience possible?
With regards to the election?
Just regards to anything, period, because it seems as if social media isn't doing enough to get everything out there. And it seems like that's where a lot of people are getting their information from now, with technology being the way it is.
I think social media is, it's a reality. It's reaching way more people than the more traditional media, by far. And I want to say there's a place for both, and perhaps the solution is to combine the two. That's a lot of people who get their news from sources like The Daily Show, or the comedic news sources. They're getting it not even from watching those shows on TV, they're getting it from people reposting clips, and that's kind of the goal of the show, is to have post-worthy segments, right? So if we can get, mainstream news stories that people are sharing through social media and getting that out there, that's a start. I think trying to go around social media because it's not good enough isn't the way to go. I think social media is how you can reach the most people right now, and it has to be a part of any campaign, of any plan, any advocacy, but it can get better. And there's going to be something new at some point. There always is.
Tom?
So your question presumes that there's like some entity that is trying to help the democracy by providing information, better information or more information to people. And that just doesn't exist. These media companies now are focused entirely on profit, and there's no connection anymore between the media and the social good, which there was an attempt in the 20th century to prevent media consolidation and to provide both sides of an issue, for example, and require that by the national government. Those days are long gone now. And so we are in the Wild West again in terms of information. And while there may be a lot of advantages to that in a democracy, there's also a lot of disadvantages. And so the other half of that equation is that people have to want to be informed. They can't just walk around saying, yeah, I'm informed because I read Facebook. That's almost a sort of a willful ignorance, because these people, we know we're not getting anything like a full spectrum of ideas to weigh.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Tom. That's all the time we have for today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for watching On Point. You can follow us on social media by searching CSUN On Point. You can watch us on LA 36 Sunday mornings at 11:30 or listen to us at KCSN 88.5 FM at 5:30, also on Sunday mornings. For all of us here on Point, I'm Gabrielle Ortega.